This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm delighted to be joined by my two co-hosts, the fabulous Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, Luke. I'm coming to you from Gadigal Land in Sydney.
And noted CBAM enthusiast Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
It's been a difficult week for CBAM enthusiasts.
Isn't it always a difficult week for CBAM enthusiasts?
No! The life of the CBAM enthusiast is a carefree one of delight. But as we record in the past week, the EU Parliament didn't quite manage to conclude a successful vote on CBAM.
Oh, no.
They were trying to vote on that and a lot of other things. And in an oddly familiar situation to Australians, the disagreement between people who wanted to go hard on climate and people who wanted to go really, really hard on climate resulted in nothing getting passed and a lot of legislation, including CBAM, going back to committee to have a bit more argy-bargy.
Well, I'm just delighted that you have confirmed your status as Australia's leading commentator on CBAMs with that late-breaking report. On this week's show, we're going to look at a fascinating new framework designed to build integrity and transparency into corporate action on emissions reduction. But, Frankie, I know episode 2 is pretty early to be proposing new segments, but these are extraordinary times, right? And I think there's a pretty strong case for energy crisis corner in which we unpack the latest from the smouldering hellscape, which is Australia's electricity and gas markets. As we record, Australia's energy ministers met 5 days ago. I think a accelerating effort on a capacity mechanism was the key thing coming out of their communique. What strikes you about where we currently stand?
I thought it was really positive that Chris Bowen, the new federal climate change and energy minister, brought his state and territory colleagues together, and by all accounts there were positive, musings on that meeting, noting that there was an atmosphere of collaboration, and it seemed like everyone was leaning in and wanting to work constructively together. So that's always a good outcome.
I do think on that, the fellow feeling that was evident in the communique. I was interviewed by Sammy J on Breakfast Radio here in Melbourne the day after the communique came out, and the main thing that he was interested in was whether everyone was just super happy that Angus Taylor wasn't in the room anymore. The Breakfast Radio take on the interpersonal relationships between our energy ministers. Wouldn't that be a fascinating reality TV show in the midst of an energy crisis? Lock them all in the Big Brother house, I say, and just watch them while they sort it all out.
We definitely can't vote any of the jurisdictions out of the house. Individual residents may come and go.
Do we think WA's was on the previous season of Big Brother, having won it, and is just commentating from the couch as everybody else tries to sort themselves out?
I have particularly enjoyed watching every journalist from Western Australia crowing about their capacity market over the last week, because apparently that's a solution to all of our problems.
Yes. Well, look, they've got a bit of a leg up over other jurisdictions because Collie doesn't export black coal to the rest of the world. So the price of running coal-fired power stations in Collie has not gone to $150 a megawatt hour plus. Of course, more within their control. The gas reservation policy they have for the time being means that they don't have $30 a gigajoule, $40 a gigajoule gas prices. And so the cost of running a gas peaking plant is not $400 a megawatt hour either. So they've got some luck. They've got some self-manufactured luck. They're doing pretty well in WA. Good on them. Now let's try and sort out the East.
Indeed. All right. Shall we get into a report?
We shall.
Raring to go.
The Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative was launched in 2021 in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow with the goal of providing a clear framework for credible corporate participation in voluntary carbon markets. It has just released a draft provisional claims code of practice which aims to set some guardrails for what constitutes credible voluntary use of carbon credits. Interestingly, this document goes beyond the integrity of carbon credits, although this is obviously important, and considers the circumstances in which they can be credibly deployed. And we should say that this is a draft that is currently out for consultation, but it is a fascinating intervention. Frankie, when this came across our desk, you were very excited. Why were you keen to chat about this?
I was, because I'm pleased to say that this report was a recommendation of one of our dear listeners. So a big shout out to Joe Karten. He's the head of sustainability and social impact at Built and a good friend of mine. And I was very pleased to hear that he'd been listening to, well, at least our trailer at the time. And he was very keen for us to start unpicking the minutiae of this particular document.
It was very exciting. As you say, the trailer in episode 1, the cavalcade of warm feelings and enthusiasm for our little podcast, and some really great suggestions from a number of quarters. It was hard to make a choice last week when we were going through them all, but this is where we landed, Frankie.
So Luke's given us a broad brushstrokes overview of what we're going through here. I think it would be good to talk a little bit about who the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative is, what exactly we're looking at, and a little bit more detail. Maybe I'm doing a bit of a who, what, when, where, and why situation up front.
It is. That sounds great.
Yeah, all right. Let's do it. So the who part of this is the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, henceforth known as VCMI, acronym check. They were established to help ensure that voluntary carbon markets can make a significant, measurable and positive contribution to achieving Paris Agreement outcomes and also promoting inclusive sustainable development. They're supported by the UK government at the moment. I think they were an announcement by Alok Sharma, who's the president of COP26, at one of the lead-up events last year. And at the moment, they're co-funded by 2 organisations in the UK, the Children's Investment Fund and the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The other who to talk about here is, who is this document produced for? So it's out here for companies that are seeking to make credible voluntary use of carbon credits and associated claims on their journey towards decarbonising their operations and making public claims about those actions. Beyond those who are seeking to use it for their own purposes, so for their companies, I guess it's also intended as a source of information for individual and institutional consumers. So not that I can imagine a mum and dad picking this one up on a weekend to help them decide.
I'm a dad, Frankie. I picked it up on the weekend.
Well, okay, you would be the exception to this particular rule, Luke. I don't see too many other mums and dads picking up this particular document to read about whether the carbon neutral soap they saw in the aisle of the supermarket stacks up. But
that's fair.
If we get these sorts of things right, and you would see consistency in the sorts of products that are marketing themselves as carbon neutral, climate positive, carbon negative. There are a lot of terms out there. That's partially one of the reasons that this document exists. If we have some clarity and consistency out there about the claims being made by different companies, that's going to build consumer confidence and ultimately build a market for these kinds of products that are aligned with strong climate action. I guess the other potential audiences for this are investors, so more on the institutional side of things. So investors wanting to make judgments on the credibility of claims before investing their money or others' money, as the case may be, in super funds and the like. And as well governments. So let's not forget the role that governments have around the world. Like there are varying degrees of appetite for regulating corporate reporting requirements when it comes to climate action. that is an area where there's significant movement at the moment. But suffice to say, there are important audiences for this document that go beyond the companies seeking to apply this for the purpose of their own claims. So what is the guts of this document? Well, like Luke said, it's a provisional claims code of practice, so it's in draft, and it sets out a 4-step process to underpin claims that could be made by companies, either enterprise-wide claims or claims relating to specific products or services.
So if they want to say, my company is carbon neutral, or this flight to London is carbon neutral, or it's on a path to being carbon neutral.
That's right.
Then this is relevant to, well, does that claim have any veracity or not?
Absolutely. And so there's 2 important things you highlight there. It could be applied to both of those circumstances, although this document goes into a lot more detail on the conditions around claims for enterprise-wide claims, not so much on products and services. It sets out some more basic criteria to look at, and they acknowledge that they're not going into detail on that side of things. But the other thing is, this isn't just about making claims on when you get to the end point that you've scoped, whether that's being carbon neutral or climate positive or net zero, or however you're seeking to phrase that. It's about your journey along that basis. So the 4 steps take you through that. The first one is around meeting an amount of prerequisites before you're eligible to make a claim against this code of practice. Then it asks you to identify the claims that you're making. So when it comes to organisational-wide claims, they set out 3 levels, the classic gold, silver and bronze. Gold obviously being equated to their version of best practice, and I think we'll get stuck into the detail of that in a little bit. The 3rd step is the purchase of high-quality offsets. I have some thoughts about what's there or what isn't there in the material. And then the 4th one is around reporting transparently on the purchase and retirement of the offsets that you've procured for your claim. So that's the 4-step process. There are key principles, and I think also as we go through the document, I think there are some interesting issues that it picks up on. The degree to which it deals with those issues, I think, is pretty variable, and I think we've all got some thoughts on some of those.
Maybe let's start with the reason why this exists at all, which is that these sorts of claims and the use of offsets to make them are very controversial. There's a lot of people who hate this whole idea, and to me, the reasons why they hate it fall into 3 buckets. One is that they think the offsets are fake. 2 is that they think offsets can be themselves damaging, whether they're involving projects that are violating the rights of Indigenous peoples, say, with some dam projects, hydroelectric projects that have been proposed at times, or they've got other environmental harms associated with them, like if they're monoculture, plantation forests replacing biodiverse wildlands. And then the 3rd category of objection is they worry that people or businesses are just buying offsets instead of doing transformation of their own activities. And I think this code and a lot of other initiatives that it's trying to build on are trying to answer all of those objections in a systematic way. But, what do we reckon? Are they on the right track for tackling any of those?
I was looking through the various diagrams and the bronze, silver and gold. Can I just say a medal system for achieving net zero? Probably not where I would have started, particularly when you're just phasing out one of the metals in about 8 years. Doesn't make a huge amount of sense. They might want to have another run at that. Again, this is a draft. They're putting it out there. I'm sure they'll get lots of feedback.
I think they've done a good job at articulating the buckets of issues, and I think everyone would agree that voluntary carbon markets are essential in unlocking private sector capital to drive climate action beyond state actors when we talk about the Paris Agreement. But there needs to be credibility around those claims, and I think to the extent that consistency is possible and there's sort of transparent, robust kind of criteria around that, that will go a long way to addressing some of the critiques that have been made around use of carbon credits. But I think for me, this document disappointed me in a couple of ways because I was really looking for more detail on a couple of key steps, I guess, in their process that they really didn't go into in more detail. And I thought that's where a lot of the current debate and issues lie, particularly around what constitutes a high quality carbon credit. It really doesn't try weigh in on that too much, besides setting some very basic criteria. So there's a few things in this where I think I would have hoped for a more aggressive or sort of progressive view from the authors. What might be a little apparent in this is that when you go through an exercise like this, and I think they mentioned working with 37 odd experts in this space, you're going to get disagreements about how far to push certain criteria. And I think they've probably erred on the side of being less prescriptive than I might have expected.
It is very high level. And in some places where there are those deep concerns around, credibility of carbon credits. And I thought that's what we were getting into. I was actually thought we were going to be wonking out about, verification and integrity of carbon markets. And it's not really what this document is at all. It's kind of a very high-level framework for thinking about how one would structure your commitments and then tracking progress against those commitments in a sort of a transparent way. Like, these are the broad buckets of things you need to be thinking about. Where I thought it was interesting was less the integrity of the carbon credits, because it doesn't really have that much to say that isn't said in a lot of other places. And I was more interested in the deployment of the credits and where you are allowed to deploy the credits, because
pretty restrictive.
My reading is no carbon credits for Scope 1 or 2 emissions. No, actually, no, there's a distinction there, right?
Yes. The
distinction is no carbon credits for achieving your emissions reduction target.
Yes. That's right.
Yeah, that's the trick. So you are in fact encouraged to use them for the emissions that remain after you have after you've achieved your target. So to achieve your target, say I want to by 2025 I'm going to cut my Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50%. That all has to be within your own operations, and then to achieve a gold standard, you need to offset with credible offsets, whatever that is, for the remaining 50%. Did I get there in the end?
It's close. This document takes a lot of reading, but the foundation of what they're trying to do, to me, is focused on that third of the objections that I listed. Are you doing offsetting instead of transforming your core business? Exactly. So they're saying you absolutely have to have science-based 1.5 degree compatible targets for what's actually going to happen in scopes 1, 2 and 3 of your business, not just a 2050 net or before net zero goal, but a series of interim targets on the way to that. And you've got to achieve those interim targets. You've got to be demonstrating actual progress to achieving those targets. And then you can do some offsetting on top of that. That's the extra bit. And for gold, you're offsetting everything beyond your targets, and they recognise, well, that's
very expensive to do.
Depending on what business you're in.
Exactly.
Yeah. If you have any emissions, that's expensive. So I think with this whole framework, it's very important, and I think the authors see it in this light. It's not the solution to everything. It's not in any way a replacement for, and like voluntary action in general is not a replacement for policy. But there are a bunch of companies that are making commitments. There are a bunch of companies who want to do something more, and they do need a basis for them to distinguish what something more that's good actually is, and for others to be able to tell whether they're absolutely talking nonsense or they're doing something genuinely helpful. And if we just see it within those less ambitious parameters, this is not going to carry the weight of global decarbonisation, then I think we can have a useful discussion of how the rules should be set up and how is this effort going, which is like, it's not bad. I think it's pretty good on the establishing confidence that businesses are genuinely looking after their own knitting before they get into external abatement.
I agree with that to a large extent, but I think with an important asterisk for me. Could we go back to some of the prerequisites that we're talking about here? So they do specifically refer to Science-Based Targets Initiative as like perhaps a preferred framework through which a company would define its emissions trajectory on the way to its its ultimate objective, whether you define that as net zero, climate positive, however we're talking about it, it's aligned to 1.5 degrees. I know there are various views on science-based targets, and I'm probably revealing mine in the course of this conversation, but one of the other ways to think about this is that you're effectively defining a carbon budget that tells you that's the worst you could possibly do in terms of emissions and still be aligned to a 1.5 degree scenario future. So that the whole trajectory is premised on this is what I must do to be consistent with that 1.5 degree scenario. But it's not exactly framed around being more ambitious than that. And I think sometimes that's lost in some of the commentary around science-based targets. We should be thinking about it as a target boundary, and we should be aiming to be much more ambitious if we can. So I think there's a simple way to look at that. If you're setting a net zero target that achieves a better than 50% reduction in your own emissions by 2030 and you're targeting net zero before 2050, you're effectively meeting the bulk of the criteria around science-based targets aligned to that 1.5 degree trajectory around emissions that are under your operational control. And then beyond that, on the Scope 3 piece, you need to have an effective procurement program to decarbonise your supply chain and do things that you can to influence your downstream emissions as well. So I just think we're sometimes at risk of overcomplicating things with science-based targets, and maybe it's not a popular critique, but if you were to draw the curve, down towards zero, that's really your worst case scenario that's consistent with that 1.5 degree future. And I, sometimes wish that we were focused on having a conversation that was more ambitious than that.
I think that's fair. I think that, there's a little bit of let 1,000 flowers bloom in this document saying, all the things, you can align yourselves with all these different things and we're standing on the shoulders of giants. They are very science-based targets curious, and if you're not a fan of science-based targets, then maybe, that is a strike against this report.
Perhaps I will get off my science-based targets soapbox in just a second. Just to give a more concrete example, like there are companies that I work with in my day-to-day that have net zero targets well before 2030 that haven't gone through the exercise of doing a science-based target, but they're inherently more ambitious than that and still have to jump through the hoops of going to do that because that's where the expectation has been set up, and it's going to tell them to do something that's less ambitious.
But this might be the crux of it, right? Because coming at it from the other perspective, how many of those organisations have committed not to use offsets for their Scope 1 or 2 emissions?
In my circle, there's a convention, I think, that we're trying to push in the property sector that would not allow the use of carbon credits to offset Scope 2 emissions. That should be dealt with through LGCs or green power, voluntarily retired against the RET. And then in Scope 1, it's how quickly can you phase out the fossil fuel sort of gas use in your buildings. So there's a short-term piece around the use of offsets.
Although, a controversial interjection, LGCs and green power are just another form of offset.
I know they're not. Are we going to get into a carbon accounting fight, Tennant? I don't want to.
I think that might have to be a bonus episode.
I will leave it there. Suffice just to say that LGCs are an energy credit. They're not measured in carbon, even though they're used as that proxy. And the point at which you apply them in your carbon account is not the same as the use of carbon credits used as offsets after the fact to square up your carbon account. They're minused from your energy consumption.
Issues around additionality and issues around the correspondence between an accounting credit and the actual physical activities that go into a business. They're as relevant. Those things are as relevant to energy units as they are to forestry units.
I am probably with Tennant on this one.
I totally agree with that. My objection is more on a technical basis.
It's offsets all the way down.
I look forward to our Christmas special.
And listeners are trembling with anticipation right now.
All right. I'll be really honest. I know that the integrity of offsets is super important. I don't care about it that much. It's not that, this is a very broad space of climate and energy. That's not one of the things that I get particularly excited about. And so I was actually super jazzed when I read this potentially, stolid, accounty sort of, how do we ensure the integrity of carbon credits thing. And I was like, it's actually all about how we make sure companies aren't wasting their time buying offsets for stuff that they could do themselves. Which is, I think, the piece where this is the strongest, because it's setting a norm that you don't use offsets to meet your emissions reduction commitments to reduce your own Scope 1 or 2 emissions, which for many companies, and I know, we're talking about some sophisticated companies that have been thinking about this for a long time. For many companies, they're going to be getting their head around this stuff for the first time in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, in the next 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. And what is presented to them as credible action is really, really important, because there is a bit of a furphy that rolls around the place that you can get to net zero, or you can get to carbon neutral, or whatever it is. And for listeners at home, I'm making the little talkie marks with my with my fingers.
It's great audio.
And you can offset your way to net zero. You can't. You can't. And maybe you can get to a media release that way and sort of feel good about yourself for 5 minutes, but that doesn't get us through the transition that we need. And so the bit of this which I was excited by was giving some very sort of black and white, this is what's okay to do in terms of the use of offsets. And interestingly, it's not anti-offset. It is actually super pro-offset, because it's saying, and, we'll give you literally a gold star if you then go and buy offsets for all the emissions that you haven't been able to deal with within your own operations or in your supply chain. So I thought that was quite elegant. I think that the actual kind of framework itself, it's like so clearly a first cut. like this is never going to survive contact with the real world. It'd be fascinating to see how this evolves, because they've got, like, you know, Google's trying this out. They've got various, you know, big companies saying, yeah, we'll try out your framework, and then they'll no doubt go back and say, yeah, this framework doesn't work. and hopefully something comes out of this that sort of retains that core element, which I found really appealing.
Totally. And a couple of the things, I think, to your point, it is very elegant in the way it sort of seeks to address, I guess, what those prerequisites are. So we, like, regardless of whether you follow science-based targets or not, the focus is very much about emissions reduction within your own operations and what you can effectively control as the foundational piece. And then it's building on that. I think it goes beyond other programs I've seen in terms of requirements around interim targets.
Yep.
So that, I thought that was novel and setting the bar pretty high.
So we should say they require a 2025 target and 5 yearly interim targets to 2050 or whenever you're hitting net zero, I guess.
Yeah. So they require that first near-term target at 2025, all within 2 years of making a public long-term net zero commitment, and then subsequent targets no more than 5 years apart. All
right, we've been talking about this for a really long time, but I know you've all got more thoughts on this that you need to get out there. Frankie, lightning round. What are your 2 or 3 extra points that you want to make before we leave the good people at VCMI to consider all the well-meaning feedback that is no doubt headed in their direction, so they can continue to improve this important framework?
Okay, I will be as quick as I possibly can. The thing that surprised me the most about this framework was that it really didn't go into a lot of detail about what it thought a high-quality offset looks like. It did name some of the criteria that are important to consider, like additionality, like measurability. It talked about co-benefits. It talked about respect for human rights. And also respect for Indigenous peoples. But I think it failed to sort of set any thresholds around, you know, what would be acceptable or even good practice against some of those criteria. So, you know, additionality, we can look at the way that, like, ACCUs have defined additionality as a proxy, as a useful kind of guide, that they need to be new projects, they can't be required to meet government regulations, they can't be a part of other government programs. So I think there's a lot of subjectivity around additionality claims, and if you set the bar too high, nothing could be called additional. But if you set it too low, everything qualifies as additional. So there's a whole conversation in that.
So just on that though, is that potentially because there's other people working on that problem specifically, and there was a sense in the report that they didn't want to step on other people's toes or be seen as duplicative? Is there some sort of issues around just, you know, scope of what this effort is trying to do relative to other efforts?
They definitely give a nod to a couple of other efforts, including the International Aviation Offsetting Scheme and another high-level sort of integrity of carbon markets initiative. And they broadly say, we're giving some high-level points, but you go see them for the nitty-gritty. And then they move on.
Nothing to see here.
Which is why this is a 50-page report and not a 500-page report.
Exactly. And so I think perhaps what I was expecting this framework to cover, I need to go and wait for the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market to put out there. I think they're putting out some core principles and an assessment framework later this year, like I think even in July. So it will I think, try and grapple with some of these. So I think, the other elements around permanence, it also didn't weigh into whether carbon reduction or removal offsets are preferable in the long run. So, emission reduction offsets, obviously you can link those to energy efficiency projects, avoided chemical emissions, renewables and things like that. But, it's hard for those kinds of projects to sort of demonstrate how they would meet additionality, particularly when we're getting to a point where our grid is decarbonising to such a huge extent. And then on the carbon removal side, obviously we default to conversations around nature-based offsets here because we don't have really a market for sort of geological sequestration yet. So that's an evolving space. So yeah, look, I was looking for some of that detail. I didn't find it. I'll wait for the next report and we'll definitely talk about that when it comes out.
I can't wait.
Oh, and wait, can I just add one more thing that's related to this?
This isn't the one more thing segment, Frankie.
But I've got my head in this on the day-to-day, and I do think for our dear listeners that care about this stuff, there is a whole conversation about how you mitigate risk around some of these things on additionality and permanence. So we're seeing an evolving approach by corporates to dealing with this. So some corporates are choosing to purchase a percentage more offsets than they would require as a form of, I guess, hedge against risks associated with those. And even going to the point of establishing insurance pools around offsets, in the case of underperformance. So there's a lot to unpack in that space. And I was hoping for more, but I as I've been told, I need to shut up and wait for the report that actually deals with it in the detail that I was hoping for. The end.
Tennant, closing remarks.
So just two things of interest. One is that this report it's very focused on how do you get big volumes of emissions reductions now and over time in line with your targets, and offset purchases are seen as a source of volume. And it doesn't have that much relevance, I think, maybe I'm wrong, to the sorts of further out initiatives that some big businesses are starting to experiment with, like pre-commitment to purchase extremely expensive units from direct air capture carbon removal and a range of other embryonic technologies. And those things are not going to produce huge volumes in the near term, but they are going to produce learning and push frontiers and do stuff that might be important for later. Yep. This framework doesn't really have anything to say, I think, about that kind of effort at the moment. Maybe in terms of the long-term targeting and succession of targets that the companies are expected to take on, but it's not quite getting to that stuff. The second thought is about corresponding adjustments, which really is about the fit between stuff that companies commit to and stuff that governments commit to. So corresponding adjustments, they're not well explained, I think, in the report.
Tennant, tell me about Article 6.
You do that right at the end when you're telling us to wrap up.
Strap in.
And we're just settling in for a fascinating conversation.
I promise the short version of this. Corresponding adjustments are about when abatement or carbon units are transferred from one country to another. So if Australia is selling forestry-based carbon credits to Japan, say, we send them 1 unit representing 1 tonne of abatement. The corresponding adjustment is we add 1 tonne of emissions onto our national carbon accounting so that there's no double counting, so that Japan isn't counting that credit and we're counting the absence of emissions. And that's a really important concept for international accounting. It's a big deal, a major advance. And one of the things that was agreed in Glasgow is every transfer between countries has got to have these corresponding adjustments. There's a limited exception for some old stuff, but going forward, everything's got to have them. But does a company that's buying an offset have to ensure that there's been a corresponding adjustment for a unit that it's buying? This is an open question. It's left open by the paper. They're just saying, well, be clear, like tell people if you're using units that haven't had a corresponding adjustment. I'm a bit neutral actually on this question because like the reason to have them between countries is every country needs to have a commitment. The commitments need to, like we're not in this Kyoto world anymore where some people had no commitments and anything they did was additional. And corresponding adjustments plus the ever greater ambition that's required for the core commitments that countries make, like those are meant to add up to a global outcome. Company stuff, there's no global mandatory, everybody's got to have a target. The sum of corporate commitments doesn't have to add up to something. And the interface between those corporate things and government things is weird. So I think it's going to remain weird. I think people will keep arguing about it.
Hey, the question I have for you is using this report's own bronze, silver and gold medal rating, what do you give this report, Frankie Muscovich?
Well, the question in my mind is how influential this is going to be in the next little while. So Australia has its own... We have our own framework in Climate Active. There's some similarities to what's in this framework, but I think some pretty notable and important differences. So I think I'm going to give it a silver for effort, and also, you know, based on the potential for prospective impact. I do think Australia is a country that seeks for an investment for listed companies, and I think if this is a framework that international investors seize on and want to see in companies' disclosures against their net zero strategies, how they're aligned to VCMI, gold, silver or bronze, I do think that will drive some activity here. So to the extent that it might be influential, I think it would be good for Australian-based companies to engage with it and provide feedback.
Tennant, gold, silver, bronze.
Look, I think some people would be tempted to say, to award this a mithril medal. Sounds very strong, but unfortunately it's all fiction.
What? It saved Frodo's life.
I'm going to give it an aluminium medal. It's pretty good, but it's a bit light.
I'm going to go with like a chocolate gold coin.
Harsh. I thought you were the one that was the most positive on
It was
this.
delicious inside. It's like, oh, this is not very substantial. I thought, oh, this is delightful. I really enjoyed this report that someone made me read.
The warm feelings will stay with you long after the report itself has been crumpled up and thrown in the bin.
I honestly think it is an interesting first stab at a difficult area. Lots of people with lots of very strong opinions. It's not surprising that it's a bit high level. I was impressed that it was as forthright on some of the things that it was forthright on, and it gives me some optimism that we'll be hearing more from the folk at VCMI. So we've all got slightly different opinions on this report, but I think we all agree it's a productive contribution to the debate, and are interested to see its next iteration. What should our listeners do if they're interested in making a contribution to the evolution of this document?
They should get online quick smart to vcmintegrity.org and download the report and formulate their comments and submit them to the VCMI by the 12th of August. So this is an interactive episode. It's not just passively observing. You, dear listener, can shape the outcome on this issue.
This episode brought to you by VCMI. Not really. Otherwise, Frankie would have said nicer things about it. All right. As always, we're closing out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what do you have?
Well, I have the same thing that I had last time because the situation seems to be changing, or maybe not. The Victorian gas substitution roadmap, never more relevant than in this extraordinarily high gas price winter and probably more high prices to come long after winter. I said last time the roadmap might be out within the next month. Maybe it won't be. There's been some media reporting in the past week that the paper might be delayed until after the November Victorian election. And if so, it'd be a pity. There's a lot that would be useful to get a steer on from that report, especially for finalising infrastructure investment proposals by both gas and electricity networks. The earliest steer for those processes would be really welcome, but we might be talking about it for a good long while to come. We might be talking about this well into next year if the reports are right.
So we need gas substitution roadmap corner now, is what you're telling me?
We might need to start on some of the substitution without a roadmap. Freestyle gas substitution.
Gas substitution as rap battle is what you're proposing, Tennant.
Yes, absolutely. I think if we could get the Energy Networks Association and My Efficient Electric Home Facebook rapping away, our winter entertainment is settled.
Very good. All right, Frankie, what do you have for us?
I've got things to say about cars, more specifically zero emissions cars in Europe. So I think what was CBAM's loss in the European Parliament, Tennant, is was the legislation on vehicle emissions gain. So one of the few votes that European Parliament got through last week was to back a final report which basically recommends the phase out of combustion engines in all new cars and vans by 2035. So Europe is going to have zero emissions cars and sort of light utility vehicles from 2035. I thought it was interesting that one of the proposed amendments in terms of an alternative to that didn't get up, and that was proposing I think a 90% emissions reduction by then with no clear end date for phasing out combustion engines. So Europe is moving on this. And I think an interesting side note, and this is how I fit two things into my one more thing, was an interesting article I read with some commentary from Saskia Esken, who's the co-leader of Germany's Social Democrats, which is the leading party in the three-party power-sharing arrangement in the current German parliament. And she was, what I could only assume, front-running some ideas that they might look at if fuel prices don't come down in the next few months. So they've done a similar thing over in Germany where they've cut the sort of fuel excise or tax that people pay at the Börse on a temporary basis. And she was talking about, very controversially, introducing a speed limit on the autobahns in Germany. Very unpopular. And I think it speaks to perhaps the cultural differences between Germany and us in Australia, when that's significantly more controversial than some of the other things she was putting forward, which include driving bans. So she talked about a Sunday driving ban using legislation that was affected during the 70s oil crisis that gave the government, special interventionist powers when it comes to these sorts of things. And she was also, I think, foregrounding the idea of not just driving bans and temporary speed limits, but also bringing power companies under government control and putting price caps in place. So watch that space. Very interesting. There are similar, obviously, conditions over in Europe when it comes to the cost of fuel. Everyone is paying through the nose. It will be interesting to see if they take up any of those controversial measures.
It's super interesting that it's hailing back to the oil crisis of the 70s, which hit most other parts of the world a lot harder than it hit Australia, just because of the surfeit of cheap, readily available energy sources here in Australia. So we're a little bit insulated. So some of those mechanisms that have been lying in legislation there in Germany perhaps don't exist here in the same way, but maybe in the process of being crafted over the next few months, if things continue in the trajectory which they seem to be running along. Hey, very quickly, one more thing from me. Reading this report from VCMI put me in mind of a local contribution in this space from our friends at Climate Works Centre, who last year put out the best practice for Australian net zero commitments guide, part of their net zero momentum tracker series, sort of more focused on telling the story for companies that they're getting their head around what credible emissions reduction targets look like in this space. But it covers a lot of the same ground. The headlines are aligned in terms of a clear long-term target, an ambitious interim target, doing what you can within your own operations, and using offsets as something that's additive once you've done all that, rather than where you start. But usefully, it also weaves in a bunch of examples from Aussie companies and how they're applying these broad principles. So if you're looking for an Australian spin on the topic we've covered today, it's worth checking out.
Sounds great. Adding it to the list of things.
All the things, all the great reports. Tenant, Frankie, I think that's an episode.
Would.
And a half.
If you have comments, questions, or something you want us to cover on a future episode, and as we've demonstrated on today's episode, we're actually listening and we will actually read the report that you suggest, or we promise to consider it at least. You can hit us up on Twitter, because we haven't set up the email address yet. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich, Tenant is at Tenant Reid, and my handle is at Luke Menzel. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your podcast app of choice, and you'll find this and all future episodes, as well as the one we recorded a couple of weeks ago, at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tenant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. All right. We just talked about that for an hour.
I could have gone for so much longer.
I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm just feeling sorry for future me that has to edit this.
Luke, you need a science-based commitment to cut this podcast, and you need to make greater progress in each future 5-minute pledge period to further reduce it. And I don't want you to rely on pieces of other podcasts that are brought in to replace windy bits of our goings-on. You start with cutting our work before you start relying on anybody else's.